Elias Crane was 11 years old the first time someone called him broken, and he was 17 the day he spent his last $150 on a houseboat that sat at the bottom of Cutter's Bayou with half its hull kissing the mud. The marina clerk laughed so hard he had to set down his coffee, but Elias could not hear him laugh, and never heard anyone laugh, and never heard anything at all in his life, and so he simply held out the crumpled bills and pointed at the listing one more time until the man shrugged and scribbled out a receipt on the back of a gas station napkin. That napkin was the first thing Elias ever truly owned. He had been sleeping in the back of a church van for 9 weeks by then. Before the van, it was the floor of a laundromat in Port Sulphur, Louisiana, where the owner let him stay until a customer complained about the boy who never answered when you spoke to him. Before the laundromat, it was his mother's apartment, but his mother had not been there since February, since the night she packed one suitcase, kissed his forehead while he slept, and drove away with a man whose name Elias never learned. She left a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I am sorry, baby. I just cannot do this anymore." He found it the next morning, next to a bowl of cereal she had already poured for him, the milk going warm. He was 15 then. 2 years of moving through the world like a ghost no one wanted to touch. But 3 days before the houseboat, Elias found something pinned to the community board outside a bait shop in Slidell. A faded yellow index card, handwritten in ink so old that it turned the color of rust. It read, "Houseboat for sale, $150 or best offer, slip 19, Cutter's Bayou Marina, sold as is where is." And below it, in smaller letters, someone had added, "She still has good bones." Elias tore the card from the board and held it against his chest like it was a letter from God. He hitched a ride on the back of a produce truck that smelled like overripe strawberries and diesel. The driver let him off at a gravel road that cut through a stand of bald cypress draped in Spanish moss so thick it looked like the trees were wearing funeral veils. The air was heavy. Late September in southern Louisiana, the kind of heat that sits on your collarbone and refuses to move. Elias walked 1.5 miles down that road with his backpack digging into his shoulders. And when the bayou finally opened up before him, dark and still as poured glass, he saw the marina for the first time. It was barely a marina. 7 wooden slips jutting out from a bank of packed red clay, most of them empty, a few holding aluminum fishing boats with peeling paint. A single light hung from a pole near the office, buzzing with insects even in the daytime. The office itself was a converted shipping container with a window unit air conditioner that dripped a steady line of condensation into the mud. Slip 19 was at the far end, past a section of dock so warped the boards had curled up like old bread. And there she sat. The houseboat was maybe 32 feet long and 12 feet wide, with a flat bottom and a cabin structure that listed about 15 degrees to starboard. Half of her port side rested against the bayou floor, which at this stretch was only about 4 feet deep. The white paint had turned the yellow of old teeth. The windows were clouded with algae on the outside and something darker on the inside. A rope of kudzu had climbed up the stern and wound itself through the railing like a living thing claiming territory. The roof was sheet metal, rusted in patches, and near the bow someone had nailed a piece of plywood over what must have been a hole. Elias stood on the dock and stared at it for a long time. He could feel the dock vibrating beneath his feet from the water moving below, that low hum the world makes when it shifts, and even though he could not hear it, he understood that the bayou was alive and that this boat, half sunk as it was still part of it. He stepped down onto the gunwale, and the whole vessel groaned and shifted, and the water around the hull churned up a cloud of silt that smelled like iron and rotting leaves and something faintly sweet, like the ghost of someone's perfume. He pulled open the cabin door. The hinges screamed. He felt it through his palms, the vibration of metal twisting against metal. Inside, the air was thick enough to chew. Mildew and damp wood and the sharp chemical smell of old varnish breaking down. The floor sloped hard to the left. Water had pooled in the port corner, maybe 2 inches deep, green with algae and dotted with dead water bugs floating belly up. But the bones, He could see the bones. The walls were tongue-and-groove cypress, hand-fitted, the kind of woodwork you cannot buy anymore. A built-in bench ran along the starboard wall with storage underneath, its cushion long gone but the joinery still tight. There was a small galley kitchen with a cast-iron sink that had turned green with patina. A wood-burning stove sat bolted to the floor near the center of the cabin, its chimney pipe still intact, running up through the roof at an angle that told him whoever built this boat understood heat and draft and the way smoke moves. The stove had a maker's mark cast into its door. Elias knelt down and wiped away the grime with his thumb. It read, Fontenot & Sons, Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, 1971. This boat was over 50 years old. Allman had built her with love. Someone had lived here once, cooked meals on that stove, watched the bayou through those windows, fallen asleep to the sound of water against the hull. A sound Elias would never know, but he pressed his palm flat against the floor and felt the water pulsing beneath, and thought maybe he knew it in his own way. He moved deeper into the cabin. Past the galley, a narrow doorway led to a sleeping berth at the stern. The mattress was gone, but the platform remained, built from the same cypress as the walls. Above it, a small porthole window looked out onto the bayou, and through the dirty glass, Elias could see the cypress trees standing in the water, like old men waiting, patient and still. And then he saw it nailed to the interior of the hull, just below the waterline where the wood was darkest and dampest. There was a letter, not taped, not tucked into a crack, nailed. Someone had driven a copper nail through the top of a sealed plastic bag, and inside the bag was an envelope, and on the envelope, written in the same rust-colored ink he had seen on the index card at the bait shop, were 2 words, for you. His hands were shaking when he pulled the nail free. The plastic bag had done its job. The envelope inside was dry, slightly yellowed, but intact. He turned it over. No name, no address, no stamp. Just those 2 words on the front, for you. As if whoever wrote it knew that someone someday would stand in this exact spot and need exactly what was inside. Elias sat down on the sleeping platform with the water dripping somewhere behind him and the entire boat creaking around him like a living ribcage, and he opened a letter. The handwriting was small and precise, the kind that comes from a hand that has written thousands of letters and knows exactly how much space each word needs. It read, If you are reading this, then you have found my boat, and I am glad. My name was Victor Edouard Doucet. I built this vessel in the summer of 1971 with wood I milled myself from cypress trees I pulled from this very bayou. I was deaf. I've been deaf since birth. I built this boat because the world had no place for me, and I decided to build my own place instead. I lived on this water for 31 years. I raised catfish. I carved birds from driftwood and sold them at the market in Slidell. I married a woman named Colette, who spoke to me with her hands and her eyes, and who died in this bed in the winter of 2002 with the stove still warm and the rain on the roof. I could not hear the rain, but she told me once that it sounded the way my hands felt on her face. I never understood what she meant, but I kept it anyway. Elias had to stop reading. His vision blurred. He pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes and breathed until the shaking stopped, and then he kept going. I am writing this letter in 2004. I am 78 years old, and my hands are not steady. I am going to a facility in Homa because my body is failing and there is no one left to help me. Colette and I never had children. Her family did not approve of her marrying a deaf man, and they cut her off. And my own family had already done the same to me when I was 16. So I am alone now, and this boat will be alone soon too. I am going to ask the marina to sell her for whatever someone will pay, and I am going to nail this letter to the hull where only someone who truly enters her will find it. If you are reading this, then you did not just look at her from the dock and walk away. You came inside. You saw past the rod. I think maybe you are like me. The letter continued on the back of the page. Under the floor of the sleeping berth, there is a compartment. Colette and I kept our important things there. I have left you what I can. It is not much in the way the world measures things, but it was everything to us. Please take care of my boat. She does not need to be perfect. She just needs to be lived in. Signed, Victor Edouard Doucet. And below the signature, one final line. The bayou does not care if you can hear it. It holds you just the same. Elias read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully, put it back in the envelope, and held it against his chest exactly the way he had held the index card at the bait shop. And he cried without sound the way he had always cried, his body convulsing, his mouth open. The grief and the gratitude so tangled together he could not tell where one ended and the other began. When he finally stopped, the light coming through the porthole had shifted from white to amber. He knelt down on the sleeping platform and ran his fingers along the edge until he found a seam. A section of the cypress floor lifted away on hidden hinges, revealing a shallow compartment lined with oilcloth. Inside he found a tin box. He opened it. There were carved birds, 7 of them, each no bigger than his palm, carved from driftwood with such detail that he could see individual feathers, the curve of a beak mid-song, the tension in a wing about to open. A heron, a pelican, a kingfisher, a wren, 3 others he could not name. Each one had a tiny price tag tied to its leg with thread, and the prices were in the range of $40 to $70. But that was 2004 money, and Elias understood instantly that these were not priced for sale. These were the ones Victor had kept, the best ones, the ones too beautiful to let go. Beneath the birds, there was a leather pouch. Inside the pouch were tools, a set of carving knives with handles worn smooth from decades of use, a small sharpening stone, a piece of sandpaper so fine it felt like cloth, and a photograph, black and white, slightly curled at the edges. A man and a woman sitting on the deck of this very boat, their feet dangling over the water, their hands intertwined. The man was thin, with deep-set eyes and a jaw like a shovel blade. The woman was small and round with a smile that took up her entire face. They were looking at each other, not the camera, and whoever took the photograph had captured the exact moment when 2 people forget that anyone else in the world exists. Victor and Colette. Elias propped the photograph against the wall above the sleeping platform and sat there looking at it until the light faded completely and the cabin went dark. He slept on that boat for the first time that night, on bare cypress, with his backpack as a pillow and Victor's letter in his front pocket. He woke at dawn to the feeling of the hull shifting with the tide, that slow rolling motion that moved through his body like a pulse, and for the first time in 2 years, he did not wake up afraid. The next morning, reality hit. The houseboat was half sunk. The port side had taken on enough water to pull her down at an angle that made standing inside feel like walking on a hillside. Elias needed to find the leak, pump out the water, and somehow right the boat. He had no money, no tools beyond Victor's carving knives, and no one to ask for help. The marina clerk, a man named Thibodeau, who chewed tobacco and communicated with Elias primarily through exaggerated gestures and facial expressions, made it clear that slip fees were $30 a month, and he would not be offering any charity. Elias wrote on a scrap of paper, "I need 30 days." Thibodeau looked at him for a long time, then held up 2 fingers. 20 days, Elias nodded. He dove under the boat on the second day. The water was warm and silty and tasted like mud and metal. He found the leak on the port side, a section of hull planking where 3 boards had separated at the seams, probably from years of sitting without maintenance. The caulking had long since disintegrated. He surfaced gasping, his eyes burning from the tannins in the water, and sat on the dock trying to figure out how a 17-year-old death boy with no money was going to fix the hull of a 50-year-old Cypress houseboat. He found the answer in a dumpster behind a boat repair shop 2 miles up the road. Tubes of marine sealant, half used and thrown away. Strips of fiberglass cloth with resin stains on the edges, but still usable. A plastic bucket with a crack in it that he patched with duct tape from the bottom of his backpack. He carried everything back to Slip 19 in 3 trips, each one taking 40 minutes in the heat, and by the end of the day, His shoulders were sunburned and his feet were blistered, and he had everything he needed. He spent the next 6 days underwater, working by feel, pressing sealant into the seams with his fingers, layering fiberglass cloth over the worst sections, holding his breath until his lungs burned and then surfacing to gulp air and go back down. The water was so murky he could barely see his own hands. He worked by touch alone, which he realized, with a sudden jolt of dark humor, was the story of his entire life. By day 8, the leaks had slowed to a weep. He fashioned the hand pump from a length of PVC pipe and a rubber flap he cut from an old inner tube, and he pumped water for 3 hours straight until the boat began to shift and rise and the port side lifted free of the mud. With a sucking sound he felt through the soles of his feet. The whole marina seemed to pause. Even the egrets on the pilings turned to look. She floated, crooked and creaking and still listing about 5 degrees, but she floated. Thibodeau walked down the dock, looked at the boat, looked at Elias, and for the first time, his expression was not mockery or pity. It was something closer to respect. He held up his hat and made a gesture that Elias understood perfectly, even without sign language. He tapped his chest twice and pointed at Elias and nodded. Not bad, kid. But on day 12, trouble came. A man in a polo shirt and pressed khakis arrived at the marina with a clipboard and a county badge clipped to his belt. He spoke to Thibodeau for several minutes, pointing at the houseboat, pointing at Elias, shaking his head. Thibodeau translated through gestures and scribbled notes. The county said the boat was not up to code. Unregistered vessel used as a dwelling. Elias needed a habitation permit, a marine survey, proof of insurance, and a sewage plan. The fees alone totaled over $1,200. Elias had $4.37. The county man gave him 14 days to comply or vacate. That night, Elias sat on the deck of his boat in the dark. The bayou stretched out in front of him, black and smooth, the cypress trees standing like sentinels at the edges. He could feel the water moving beneath him, that constant alive rhythm, and he held Victor's letter in his hands and read the line again. The bayou does not care if you can hear it. It holds you just the same. And he thought about how the world was not like the bayou at all. The world cared very much what you could and could not do. The world had forms and fees and codes and people with clipboards who decided whether you were allowed to exist in a particular place. He thought about leaving, walking away from the boat, from Cutter's Bayou, from Louisiana entirely, hitching another ride to somewhere else where he could be invisible for a while longer, until that place too found a reason to push him out. He picked up one of Victor's carved birds, the kingfisher, and turned it in his hands. The detail was extraordinary. Every feather was rendered with a precision that came not from sight, but from understanding, the kind of knowing that lives in the fingers. Elias held the bird up against the moonlight and studied the way Victor had captured the moment of diving, the body streamlined, the beak aimed at water the carver could never hear splash. Victor had been death. Victor had built this boat with his own hands. Victor had lived here for 31 years. Victor had not waited for the world to make room for him. He had carved his own room, plank by plank, bird by bird. Elias put the kingfisher down and picked up the carving knives. He found his first piece of driftwood the next morning, washed up on the bank about 100 yards from the marina. Cypress, naturally. Smooth from the water, with a grain that twisted in a way that reminded him of a woman turning to look over her shoulder. He sat on the deck and carved for 6 hours straight, not stopping for food or water, his hands moving with an instinct he did not know he possessed. When he finished, he was holding a heron, not as detailed as Victor's, rougher, younger in its lines, but alive. Something in the wood had wanted to be a heron, and Elias had simply let it out. He carved 3 more birds that week. Then he walked to the Saturday market in Slidell with the 4 birds in his backpack and a piece of cardboard that read, "Hand-carved driftwood birds, $25 each, made by a deaf kid on a houseboat," and he sat up on a folding chair he borrowed from Thibodeau. He sold all 4 in 2 hours. A woman with silver hair and turquoise rings on every finger bought the heron. She held it in both hands and looked at Elias, and her lips moved, and he could not read what she said, but her eyes said everything. She reached into her purse and handed him $50 for a $25 bird and would not take the change. By the end of the third week, Elias had sold 19 birds. He had $412. He had also caught the attention of a retired marine surveyor named Gus Arsenault, who lived 3 slips down on the sailboat with a cat named Boudreaux. Gus had been watching Elias work in the houseboat every day, and one morning he walked over with a thermos of coffee and a notepad and wrote, "I can do your marine survey for free if you fix the railing on my boat." Elias fixed the railing that afternoon. Gus did the survey the next day. It was not a perfect report, but it was honest, and it was official, and it had a licensed surveyor's stamp on it. The woman with the turquoise rings turned out to be a retired attorney named Marguerite Landry, who had a habit of showing up at the Saturday market to buy things she did not need from people who needed the sale. When she learned about the county's demands, she made 3 phone calls. The first was to the parish office. The second was to a friend at the housing authority. The third was to the county inspector's personal cell phone. Elias did not know what she said during those calls, but the inspector did not come back. Weeks passed. October cooled the bayou by a few degrees, enough that the mosquitoes retreated, and the mornings arrived with a thin mist that sat on the water like gauze. Elias worked on the boat every day. He replaced the 3 worst hull planks with cypress he salvaged from a demolished fishing camp upriver. He sanded and sealed the deck. He rebuilt the galley shelves. He found a mattress at a thrift store in Slidell for $12 and carried it on his back for 2 miles. He got the wood-burning stove working again, cleaning the chimney pipe with a wire brush made from a coat hanger and a strip of burlap, and the first time he lit a fire and felt the heat radiating through the cabin, felt it in his cheeks and his forearms and the bridge of his nose, he sat on the floor and pressed his hands against the warm cast iron and thought about Victor doing the same thing 50 years ago. By the 3rd month, the houseboat was no longer a wreck. She was not beautiful. She was patched and mismatched, and her paint was 3 different shades of white because Elias used whatever cans he could find at discount. But she was watertight. She was warm. She was home. The carving became something more than income. People began to request specific birds. A man wanted a wood duck for his wife's birthday. A woman wanted a mockingbird because her mother used to sing like one. A teacher from a school for the deaf in New Orleans drove 2 hours to buy one of his herons and ended up buying 4. And she left him a note that said, "You should teach. The kids need to see someone like them making something this beautiful." Elias read that note 7 times. Thibodeau, who had initially given Elias 20 days, stopped charging him slip fees entirely. He never explained why. He just stopped leaving invoices. When Elias tried to pay, the old man waved his hand and walked away. Gus Arsenault became something like a grandfather. He could not sign, and Elias could not hear, but they developed a language of gestures and written notes and shared silences that somehow contained more conversation than most people manage with full use of their voices. Gus taught Elias how to read the weather by watching the birds, how to predict rain by the way the catfish surfaced, how to tie knots that would hold in any storm. In return, Elias carved Gus a pelican so lifelike that Boudreaux the cat would sit and stare at it for minutes at a time, his tail twitching, convinced it was about to move. One evening in December, Gus came to the houseboat with a brown paper bag. In every Titian, a smile can be your secret strength. He sat across from Elias at the small table Elias had built from reclaimed dockboards and laid the papers out one by one. They were records from the parish archives. Marriage certificate for Victor Edouard Doucet and Colette Marie Fontenot, dated June 1973. A death certificate for Colette, dated February 2002. And a document Elias had not expected. A will. Victor's will, filed in 2004, just before he entered the care facility. In it, Victor had left everything: the boat, its contents, and a small savings account at Slidell Community Bank, to whoever purchased the vessel from Cutter's Bayou Marina. The savings account had been dormant for 22 years, The balance with accumulated interest was $6,411. Elias stared at the number. $6,411. To most people, it was a modest sum. To a 17-year-old deaf boy who had counted his life in single-dollar increments, it was a fortune. But it was what Gus showed him next that broke open the last locked door in his chest. Gus had tracked down the care facility in Houma. Victor Edouard Doucet had died there in 2009 at the age of 83. He had no visitors in his final 5 years. Not one. The facility records showed that he spent most of his days sitting by a window that faced south, toward the bayou, carving small birds from pieces of wood the staff brought him from the yard. When he died, they found 43 birds in his room, arranged on the windowsill in a line, all of them facing south, as if waiting for something or someone. Gus watched Elias read the records. He could not hear the boy cry, but he could see his shoulders shaking, and he reached across the table and put his weathered hand over the boy's hand and held it there, steady and warm, the way a dock holds a boat. Elias went to Houma the following week. He found Victor's grave in a small cemetery behind a Baptist church, marked with a flat stone that read only his name and date. No mention of Colette. No mention of the bayou or the boat or the birds. Elias knelt in the wet grass and placed the kingfisher carving on the stone. Victor's kingfisher, the one from the tin box, the one that was too beautiful to sell. He left it there with its beak aimed at the ground, diving toward water only it could see. Then he drove to the parish office and filed paperwork to have a new line added to the gravestone. It took most of the bank account to pay for it, and he did not care. The new inscription read, "He built his own place." Colette heard the rain. Spring came to Cutter's Bayou the way it always comes to southern Louisiana, sudden and lush and so green it hurts your eyes. The cypress trees filled out overnight. The herons returned to the shallows. The water warmed and the catfish stirred and the whole bayou shook itself awake like a dog after a long sleep. Elias sat on the deck of his houseboat on a morning in early April, carving a wren from a piece of driftwood that had washed up against the hull during the night. The stove was lit inside, not for warmth now, but for the smell of it, that wood smoke and cypress scent that had become the smell of home. Thibodeau was drinking coffee by the office. Das was on his sailboat, reading a newspaper to Boudreaux, who was ignoring him completely. The mist was burning off the water, and the light came through in long gold columns that turned the bayou into something a church would envy. On the railing beside him, lined up in a row facing south, were 7 carved birds. Victor's original 7, cleaned and oiled, their feathers sharp in the morning light. Next to them, a growing line of Elias's own birds, rougher but no less alive, the heron and the wood duck and the mockingbird and a dozen others, all of them facing the same direction. South, toward somewhere, toward someone. He never found his mother. He stopped looking, not because he stopped caring, but because he realized that the search had been a way of standing still, and he had spent too long standing still. Maybe she would come back. Maybe she would find him somehow. Follow the trail of carved birds to a half-patched houseboat in a forgotten bayou. Maybe she would not. Either way, the bayou would hold him. A few weeks later, the teacher from the school for the deaf came back. Her name was Renee. She brought 3 students with her, teenagers, all of them deaf, all of them watching Elias with a cautious hunger of young people who have never seen an adult version of themselves. He showed them the boat. He showed them Victor's letter. He handed them each a piece of driftwood and a carving knife and sat with them on the deck while the bayou moved beneath them, patient as a heartbeat. And he taught them the only lesson he knew. You do not need the world to make room for you. You find a piece of wood. You find a piece of water. You pick up a tool. And you carve. The houseboat still lists about 2 degrees to starboard. The paint is still 3 different shades of white. The stove still bears the mark of Fontenot and Sons, Brobridge, 1971, and nailed to the interior of the hull, in the exact spot where Elias first found it, sealed in a new plastic bag beside a copper nail that has gone green at the edges, is Victor's letter. For you, not for Elias, specifically, not for anyone specifically, but for whoever comes next. Whoever stands in the dark of a strange place and needs someone, even a ghost, even a stranger who died alone in a facility in Homa, to say the truest thing. The bayou does not care if you can hear it. It holds you just the same. And 22 years after a deaf man drove his last copper nail into the hull of a boat he was about to lose, a deaf boy sat on the deck of that same boat, in the same golden light, carving a bird from the same water's wood, and the line of birds on the railing grew longer, all of them facing south, all of them waiting, all of them proof that some things survive not because they are strong, but because someone, somewhere, built them with love and trusted the current to carry them where they needed to go.